Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's event. My name is Ara McCauley. I'm the Artistic Director of Kingston Writers Fest, and I'm pleased to present Authors at School Borders. I'm just displaying right now, we have an event sponsor or community partner for this event, which is the Kingston School of Art, and they've shared some of their exciting events that are happening. So I've just popped those on the screen for you for a second. You can find out more on their website as well. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that the lands on which the festival customarily takes place and where I am tonight or this morning is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'd like to thank the Canada Council, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of the festival. We're grateful to the organizations and individuals who support us. And for today's event, we'd especially like to thank Kingston School of Art, our community supporter for this event, and our Pathways to Education youth patron. This event is an hour long and includes a question and answer period. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of the screen at any point during the event for the moderator. And if you'd like to support Natasha and Thomas by picking up a copy of their books, our official bookseller is Novel Idea, and they have copies available to purchase in store, by phone, or online. It's hot off the press. Now I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter, Natasha Donovan. Natasha is a freelance artist and illustrator who works primarily on children's books, graphic novels, and YA book covers. Her comic illustrations have appeared in several anthologies, and she has illustrated several award-winning children's books, including The Sockeye Mother by Brett Husson, the graphic novel Surviving the City by Tasha Spillett Sumner, and the picture book biography Classified by Tracy Sorrell. Natasha is most recently the illustrator behind Borders, the stunning graphic novel adaptation based on a short story of the same name by author Thomas King. Natasha is a member of the Métis Nation of British Columbia. Please welcome Natasha.
It looks like I can't share my video. It's saying you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
One moment, please. Thank you for your.
Hi, everyone. hoping everyone can see me. Maybe that can be confirmed in the chat. Great. Okay, so hi, thank you for having me. I will start by, I'll just introduce myself briefly, and then I've put together some slides showing some of the process behind creating borders. And then hopefully, if the gods of technology are willing, I will be able to share my screen with you and show you a little bit of the drawing process. I'm a self-taught illustrator. I'm originally from Vancouver. As was mentioned, I work primarily on picture books and graphic novels, as well as some short form comic work for anthologies. And I basically stumbled into the world of illustration kind of by happenstance. It was something that I really longed for, but didn't have nearly enough confidence to make a real go of it. So I went to school for anthropology, much more practical than art, at the University of British Columbia. And after graduating, I worked in publishing for a while. I worked as an editorial intern at a magazine, and then moved over to working in academic publishing at the University of Victoria at the International Journal of Indigenous Health. And at that point, I finally managed to gather up the courage to submit some work to a comic anthology after spending years and years just drooling over other people's work. And I put together a small portfolio online, and as fate would have it, the author Brett Hewson happened upon my portfolio, and we began working together on the Mother series, which the vision for that will be a set of 10 nonfiction picture books that focus on keystone species here on the West Coast. We're about halfway through that project now. But that collaboration provided me with the opportunity to get my work out into the world in a substantial way. And I've also had the privilege of working on several other picture books and 2 graphic novels since then, well, I guess 3 now with Borders. So I'll start sharing my screen. Hopefully that's working. And okay, so fair warning, the plot to Borders is quite simple, and I find it a little hard to describe without giving most of the story away. But personally, I think a lot of the richness of the story is in the relationships and the subtle interactions between characters. But if you're not familiar with the story and you don't want any spoilers at all, I would recommend maybe going to refill your coffee or something. So Borders was first published in 1993 as a short story in Thomas King's collection, One Good Story, that one. It's told from the perspective of an unnamed narrator who is traveling with his mother from Alberta to Utah in order to go and visit his sister in Salt Lake City. When they reach the border, the narrator's mother insists on answering the question of their citizenship with Blackfoot rather than Canadian or American. And the US Customs officer won't let them into the States because you have to be one or the other. So they're turned back. But when they arrive back at Canadian Customs, they run into the same issue. The narrator's mother, again, will only answer Blackfoot when asked about her citizenship. And ultimately, they spend a couple of nights in the parking lot of the duty-free store until the media catches wind of the situation, and they show up en masse, and they kind of act as witnesses, and they interview the mother and her son, and their presence places enough pressure on the border guards, who finally reluctantly let them into the US. There are a lot of really wonderful unspoken stories running underneath the main plot elements. The relationship between the mother and the daughter, who are both in their own way kind of unable to articulate their feelings about being separated, but living so far apart. These like quiet moments of teaching and connection that happen between the mother and the narrator as they spend these nights in the car and waiting around in the parking lot. The arbitrariness of the US-Canada border as this imaginary line that's imposed upon nations that already exist, and the absurdity and also potential cruelty of enforcing this line with this like weird bureaucracy that goes into that. And one of the things that I love most about this story is how it examines what happens when the identities and values that are most important to us bump up against the rigid categories to which we are expected to conform. And that's something I think that most of us can relate to, and something that children and young adults have to contend with every day. On a personal note, I'm Canadian. I'm married to an American, and we've had no shortage of border woes of our own. In fact, we actually ran into a snag with my residency in the US that arose right before I started work on Borders on the graphic novel adaptation, and was not resolved until after I handed in the final art. So it took close to 2 years. During that time, my status was up in the air and I was unable to visit Canada. COVID was a factor, but the primary problem was that the legitimacy of my 10-year relationship with my partner was being called into question. So during the day, I was drawing these characters in their parking lot limbo. And after work, I was busy, collecting photos and little love notes and emails in preparation for a meeting with my own customs officer that would prove whether or not my relationship fit their definition of real, and would determine whether or not my husband and I could continue to live together on the same side of the line that bisects this continent. So this is a pretty literal connection to the content of Borders, but I believe that the story can be read in many ways. And I really feel like there's a lot for everyone to find in it for themselves. So the idea for Borders was introduced to me through an email from an editor, Suzanne Sutherland. She, at that time, was an editor at HarperCollins. I think she has moved on to a new position since then. But we were together for the entire time. And she approached me in 2019. And I was immediately very excited because I'd read this story as a teenager. I think it was something that was assigned to us in English 11 by Mrs. Hurd at Sentinel Secondary School. And I actually, as soon as I saw the email, I vividly remembered this story. It had really made quite a profound impact on me. And it was something that I don't remember a lot of what we read, but I did remember that. Thomas King was able to create these moments in this story that were very powerful and moving, but also dry and hilarious, which he does in all his work. That's one of his many superpowers. And then my second reaction, besides just being crazy excited, was curiosity, because Suzanne was proposing to create a full-length graphic novel, which was close to 3 times the length of anything I'd ever worked on, out of a short story that had very little dialogue and I'm pretty sure in the anthology it's less than 10 pages. But Suzanne and I had lengthy conversations on the phone, and she kind of shared her vision for the book, and I came away feeling very excited about the idea of stretching out the short story into something bigger. Comics that are really dialogue heavy can actually be pretty difficult for the illustrator to execute. A lot needs to happen, and there's very little real estate on the page, like actual physical space allocated to the art. And much of Borders is spent waiting. So like there's, they're driving, they're kind of killing time in the parking lot or wandering around the duty-free shop looking at things. They're stargazing on the hood of the car. And after all of this brainstorming with Suzanne, I was really looking forward to being able to have space to play with scenery, play with, facial expressions and body language and fidgeting, all this stuff that can kind of come out when there aren't so many distractions of like a plot heavy story or dialogue heavy story. So what I have here are some of the character designs and some of my research. So the first step was that Suzanne went away and she started working on adapting the short story prose into a script with page suggestions for each kind of beat. And I started working on character sketches and visual research, which is kind of a fancy way of saying I spent a long time on the internet. There aren't a lot of characters in this story, so I really only needed to have really established ideas of what the main three would look like. But this is an important step of making any comic, because you have to have consistency between the characters. But like as the pages go on, they need to look the same. So it's great to have something to reference. And then because there's such a strong sense of place in this story, I really wanted to try to be specific in depicting the area. I briefly daydreamed about taking a road trip to Sweetgrass. I wouldn't be able to cross the border because of my status issues, but I could drive to Sweetgrass, which is on the American side of the border, and take pictures of the landscape and get a sense of the area. But shortly after I signed on to this project, we went into our first COVID lockdown. So this became impossible. So what I did do instead was I traveled around on Google Earth. I probably spent a good few hours just clicking around, taking screenshots. I read the story many times and tried to get a sense of exactly where the narrator and his mom traveled. I kind of guessed it generally where they would have started out. And I took some screenshots of like houses and residential streets, and then moved out onto the highway and drove to Coutts, Alberta. I found a convenience store that seemed to be kind of generally matching the description of the convenience store where they stopped to buy orange soda and coffee. I took lots of screenshots of the town. The Google Earth card doesn't actually take photos of the border itself, probably illegal, but since the border would have looked different at the time of the telling of the story, I was okay with that. So I just used some historical photos instead. Some of the landscapes in the actual book are sort of composites of what I saw here. And in a couple of instances, I actually took entire scenes from what I found on Google Earth, like these guys kind of shooting the breeze on a stoop. They show up in a panel while the narrator is describing kind of the sleepiness of the town of Coots. And at this point, I also started gathering up a lot of other reference images for their house interiors. For example, I collected photos from real estate listings in nearby towns and kind of made up my own house for their car, which I struggle with, and I'm sure there are still many inconsistencies despite the reference photos, but that's just why they're so important. For positions of bodies and hands, a lot of those were just photos that I took of myself and my husband. So these are the scripts that we ended up with. So the one on the left here is Suzanne's script. So Suzanne took her version of the story and divided the prose and dialogue over 200 pages. She didn't add anything or take anything away. For the most part, I don't think any of the text was changed whatsoever. I think there were a couple of descriptions that were made very clear by the art, so it would have been redundant to leave as both art and text. So I think maybe she would have taken out, like, if the dress was described as being blue with flowers, she might have taken out the blue with flowers part. And she made suggestions about what should happen when, but she wanted to leave it fairly open-ended in terms of imagery and placement of dialogue. So I took her script and I went through and I jotted down ideas for how each page might be laid out with panels. So this is the version that I gave back to her. I was like kind of reading through her script, imagining what might be happening, what imagery I could add that would actually add to the story. And at the same time, I was working on the storyboards. So this is an example of some of the storyboards. The intention of the storyboards is to get a sense of both the layout of each individual page and as a whole, and the layout of the panels. It's where it shows like where the important action will take place and where text could fit on the page and in each panel. It's my least favorite part. I find it very difficult. It's the part where I procrastinate the most and freak my editors out. They're not supposed to be pretty storyboards. They're supposed to be very rough, and they're just supposed to effectively communicate a sense of the book to the rest of the creative team. But because of how rough they look, you can get a sense, you can feel like you're just doing the work really badly. At least that's how I feel. And it's sort of a blow to the self-esteem. They are also just not especially fun or satisfying. But every time I do them, I am reminded of how crucial they are. They play a very important role, which is, I mean, forcing you to abandon the blank page and to throw away your perfectionism. And once they actually exist, the work really flows a lot more easily. There's this thing about art that I think seems to surprise some people, which is that, and I'm sure it's true for most creative endeavors, that the initial stages can be very boring and kind of demoralizing. But at least for me, once I trudge through a couple of rough drafts, I arrive at inking, and it's so thoroughly engrossing that I forget how much I was suffering before. So on the storyboards, I tend to work really small and zoom in pretty far so that I can include many storyboard pages in a larger display, which is what I send to the editors. This gives me an idea of how the book is flowing, shows me spots where the story is moving too slowly, where there's too much going on, and I could stand to add some like quiet breathing space. I tend to work on many storyboards at once. I go back and forth between many pages. This is kind of to allow the book to develop as a whole rather than as many little pieces. And it's also to keep myself from being completely overwhelmed by boredom. So I send these to Suzanne and they look through them. I'm sure that Thomas had some kind of sign off role. And then once I get any kind of feedback on those, I move on to penciling, which at this stage, every page gets set up as an individual document, and I finalize the size of the panels, the location of the text, basically. And I start adding in all of these details that were ignored at the storyboard level. You know, these like little details of the chair and the actual imagery on the postcards and the pattern on the curtains, that kind of thing. And I'll also notice things about placement that don't necessarily make sense once I'm giving it a second pass. In this case, it looked like I noticed that the narrator's placement in the 4th and 5th panels here was making him look very teeny tiny. So I made some adjustments with size and perspective. So normally there's another stage here where I would put down the final lines. This is what that would look like, but the entire page. Send those off for another round of feedback. So at this point, though, in the project, we were starting to run a little short on time. So Suzanne, if you ever see this, thank you for your patience. So I sort of, I did the inking and the coloring simultaneously. I'm autistic, and one of my neurodivergent features is a struggle with attention. So often when I'm working on a project of this scale, I find it's a lot easier to move around the entire project, and rather than to finish each page in a linear fashion, it's easier for me. It's not easier for the editors. I apologize. Sometimes with this book, I would have days where I would like focus on inking as many bars as I could possibly handle. Or I would move around from page to page and color like everyone's jeans. So this is an example of a page that's in the middle of being both inked and colored at the same time. There's like a little vestige of the pencils left. These sections are just inked. I have this like layer of blue over everything to show me where the panel boundaries are going to be, and also to act as a little bit of like an underpainting. And this is, here's like just a comparison of pencils to final. At the color stage, I add all sorts of layers with like textures, sort of paper textures. I think in this one I was using like a rough paper texture and a watercolor paper texture with all those little bumps. I kind of play around with different brushes. I add layers for shadows. A lot of experimentation happens at this point. And I actually did this book entirely in Procreate, which is an app for the iPad, and which I can show you all momentarily, hopefully. And because this book was made during the height of the pandemic, I was no longer able to go into the co-working studio where I usually went just to kind of break up my day and actually see some humans. So I actually, in a desperate bid to get out of the house, I did a lot of this stage of the work in my car. I would load up my dog and my iPad and an external battery, and we drive somewhere shady and pretty, usually to the lake, and I would ink and color, and Luna would examine the world. Here's just an example of the entire process. So the storyboard image, the pencils image, and then the final ink and colored image. And then cover work for this book came close to the end of the project. Sometimes it's done closer to the beginning for marketing purposes, but as COVID did with so many things, it added an element of uncertainty, in this case, with regards to the publication date. So this was one of the last things that I did for the book. When I work on covers, I typically come up with 3 different concepts for the editors to choose from, editors and the art directors. They often have, I mean, almost always have like thematic similarities. So for this one, I wanted to give a sense of like a bit of a standoff feeling, to have that kind of static moment where something's about to happen, because so much of the story is you know, they're waiting to see what other people are going to decide. And I wanted to kind of give a sense of that like wide open, expansive road trip landscape, Alberta prairies. And the editors and the art directors, they obviously preferred this version on the left here. So I did 2 color variations for them, and we went with the purpley blue one, because that was kind of consistent with the way that the interiors ended up being colored. So I am going to try to share my iPad screen with you. And we'll see how it goes. This was working perfectly in the practice session. There we go. Okay, so all right, so I've done different processes for different books. I've inked by hand. I've used Photoshop. For this one, it just, because of kind of the state of the world, and the state of my life, which was quite chaotic at this point, it was a lot easier for me to be work and be mobile. So I worked entirely in this app, Procreate. It's because it's on my iPad, I've had to move a lot of files over to the computer to make room for new stuff. So what I did was I brought in a version of the work that just had the colors, sorry, the pencils. So this is what a page would typically look like, penciled. at this point, I've gotten all the feedback. I'm ready for to move on to the inks. And I have, my brushes up here. And I will just kind of start moving around the page and thinking. I don't especially like having black lines around my panels. And people can make it look so cool, but I don't like it. I don't seem to be able to manage to do it very well. So what I do instead is I have this layer on top of everything. And that's why I have this layer of color underneath everything, so I can, before the color is in place, I can still see where my panel borders are. I have like a couple of favorite brushes that I will tend towards. There are just millions and millions of Procreate brushes available online. Some of them are free, some of them cost, a reasonable amount, $10, $15 for a set. But yeah, for this project, and actually for a lot of projects, I tend to use this guy right here. I find that inking on the iPad feels really natural. I find it a lot easier than working on a tablet and another tablet, like a Cintiq, which I have done. It's not quite as satisfying as inking by hand with a brush, but I am the sole wage earner in my family, and I need to take on a lot of projects. So this is pretty good. And then I'll give you a sense of the adding colors here. The fun thing about Procreate, or one of the fun things, is that you can add these palettes. And I used to have I had a palette for the narrator, which had all of the specific colors of his shirt and his jeans, and I had a palette for the car. I don't have them anymore, but so the color I add on a layer underneath the inks just goes on like that. Typically I would ink this first, but just to give you an idea of how it works. Color. And then once that's all set up, I will go in and, make a shadow layer. I will add different layers with different effects on them, add shadows like that. Yeah, I've never done any kind of live demonstration before, so this is quite intimidating, but hopefully it will start. I mean, it'll give you a sense of what the process is like for me. Everyone has their own process, and really the only way that you can figure it out is just to keep trying and figure out what works for you. So yeah, that is pretty much all I have today. And if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Yeah, so we have a couple of schools here today, which is fabulous. And we have a question from the grade 8 class at Kingstown School. And they ask, were the color choices symbolic? For example, the yellow-orange wash on page sections versus the blue-purple wash ones?
Um, I wish I had like a really smart answer for that. um, but I tend to just work very intuitively when I am, I when I was working on the story initially, I read the short story many times, and I tried to kind of make note of like, what am I feeling? What am I sort of intuiting that the characters are feeling? And so those color choices are mainly emotional, like trying to convey a certain sense of atmosphere and emotion that I believe makes sense for the story.
Mhm. I'll just remind people again, we do have the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. So if you do have a question for Natasha, feel free to write it there. That's an interesting point, talking about like coloring or designing by emotion. And I guess I wondered if you had any tips for like ways to encourage people that are interested in getting into this, like to tap into their creativity. Like what are some are there practices or little activities that you've done that you found really useful for you?
Um, I mean, there's so many possibilities out there. I um, One thing that I really try to do, and I do it less now that I'm a professional illustrator, which is sad, and I need to be more diligent about it. But just carrying a sketchbook everywhere,
Mhm.
um, or if you're a writer, carrying a journal everywhere, and just trying to make it this sort of automatic thing where you're using it as a way to process your experience of being in the world. Um, at various times have like tried to I experiment with different mediums, and looking at other people's work is also incredibly important. I think it can lead to some like creative envy, but if you can overcome that, I think it's uh, I think that people who are starting out in some kind of creative endeavor often worry about finding a style, and ultimately, I really think that kind of it's like an amalgam of everything that you see in the world that you love, other art, other writing, just pieces of your universe.
Mhm.
So I think that's important too.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from Central Public School here. What motivates you to persevere when you find the work either challenging or boring?
um, I it's so hard. uh, um, I know that the feeling of finishing is going to be great. I know that once I have a final product that I can hold in my hand, um, that everything will be worth it. Um, and I mean, it's also just like it's a thing that I have decided to commit to, and that it's very important to me, to carry out my commitments to the work. So
Yeah, and I think there's a sense, I mean, not everything we do in life is fun, but if you can try and learn something from it, or, I'm sure that even in a really challenging piece, there's probably elements that when you look back at them, you're very proud of, like,
yeah,
that
and
kind
like that kind of adds up over time. You start to realize like, oh yeah, I remember feeling like this before, and then I stopped feeling this way when I pushed through it.
yeah. Another question from Kingstown School. So who initiated the partnership between Thomas and Natasha? Did you and Thomas collaborate at any point?
I I believe that this entire I'm not sure about the very initial stages of the idea. I think it probably happened at the level of the publisher, and I think they probably reached out to Thomas and asked whether this would be something he would be interested in. And then typically how it works is the publisher is always the one to find an illustrator. So I mean, I get the sense that Thomas is a prolific author. He's got a lot going on, and he has like this incredible genius body of work. And this is something that he wrote, you know, like almost 30 years ago. I got the sense that he just kind of gave it his blessing. And as I mentioned, that like I think he signed off at various stages. But other than that, most of the collaboration happened just between me and Suzanne.
And in other works, I mean, you have a few series that you work on now. So is there, like, have you created relationships with those authors when you're doing like a comic or something?
Yeah, it really varies. Usually when something is just starting out, there's like the publisher kind of intentionally maintains some distance between the author and the illustrator, so that, you know, they can have a level of creative control over the output, which, you know, is totally fair because they're the ones who have to sell it. But like with the picture book series, that is just this ongoing thing for me. I like Brett and I are Facebook friends, and when we start a new one, we're usually like messaging back and forth. I'm like, hey Brett, can you send me some pictures of your kids, because it says you want to include them in this page or whatever. Yeah.
But yeah, I can imagine too. I mean, you also wouldn't want, I don't think any artist wants someone just like hovering over them and staring at everything they do. So, I mean, it makes sense from that point too, where, I mean, you are hired as the artist, and your vision is really important. And, you know, someone who's really good on the page might not necessarily be the best drawer. And so for them to decide what the image is could be stifling. So.
Yeah, and I think the role of the publisher as like interlocutor is pretty useful in helping everyone to maintain a certain level of like professional distance.
So do you have any cool things on the go now? Anything you're really excited about?
Yeah, I'm working on it's another nonfiction picture book, and this one is about the building and the subsequent removal of the Elwha Dam on the Olympic Peninsula. So just the people who have lived there, how the ecosystem was damaged substantially by the building of the dam, and then the revival of that ecosystem once people fought to have it removed.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, we don't always get the stories with a happy ending.
Yeah.
Any more questions from anybody? So I guess you talked about, you know, finding your style and not having a set style. How varied would you say, or like is there a level of detail that you would bring to a graphic novel, for example, versus to a picture book, or is that pretty consistent for you?
I think that I tend to remain pretty consistent, and I think like I would just clarify and say that what I mean is like not to worry about finding a style, because it will find you. It like it's just a matter of putting enough work in. I feel like I can look back over my work over, the past, since being a teenager, and I can see kind of threads that have maintained, but there is a way that my work is more consistent now than it used to be when I was still just kind of experimenting with everything.
Mm-hmm. And how much time would you say that you spend every day drawing?
It varies a lot. Sometimes there are days when it's like more admin stuff, answering emails and preparing for Zoom webinars. But I could be anywhere from 3 to 8 hours.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. And on the higher end, like that's when I need to start remembering, okay, like I got to take a break and stretch my hand out. And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I can imagine, I mean, in any artistic pursuit, I mean, it's really excited to get carried away, but you have to breathe and eat. And
Yeah. That's the sort of trade-off when you finally get to that flow state, and then you're like, oh, I forgot that my body existed.
Yeah, so I guess like if there's no more questions from the audience, is there anything that you want to tell like the aspiring illustrators out there that are listening today?
Yeah, I mean, I think I say this a lot, and I'm also kind of trying to remind myself of it, but just try and don't worry about the bad outcomes, because they are building towards something that you will be proud of. Like every single drawing has to start out looking like just a mess. That's the reality of it, and if it doesn't start that way, you're probably not going to be able to stick with it.
Yeah, well, that's great to know. Yeah, absolutely. I think we're always so critical of there's an expectation that it has to be perfect from the start or it's not worth doing. So a good lesson to keep in mind. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to get to hear about the book and to see the process in action, and to learn a little bit more about some of the tools that you've used. I'll remind everyone that the books are for sale at Novel Idea Books in Kingston now. And if you're interested in hearing Thomas, he will be here tomorrow with his new thriller called Sufferance. It's a bit more of an adult book than this one, but yeah, he'll be joining us then. And for now, thank you so much, Natasha, and best of luck with your future creative endeavors.
Thank you for having me. It's very nice to talk to you all.